Good day, everyone. Today I will discuss the part 2, 3, and 4 of implementing rules and regulation of Quarantine Act of 2004 pursuant to RA 9271. The Bureau of Quarantine, being the health authority, is mandated to ensure security against the introduction and spread of infectious diseases, to include the emerging diseases and public health emergencies of international concern. The promotion of these health regulations are balanced by an equal concern to the minimal interference with travel and trade, and to meet the standards and requisites for quarantine operations involving both the international and domestic interests. Part 2 of this regulation: requirements of vessels upon entry from foreign ports. Section 7. Vessel to be inspected. All vessels coming from foreign ports are subject to quarantine inspection upon entry any port of the Philippines. Vessels cleared in one port of the Philippines deemed cleared for all other ports in the country except in cases of any vessel with an infectious disease subject to regulations, emerging disease, public health emergency of international concern, and or death or board. Section 8. Requirements for vessel to be inspected. Any vessel coming from foreign port subject to quarantine inspection shall be considered in quarantine until given a pratique. Such vessel shall fly a yellow flag at its foremast upon entry into the harbor, drop its anchor at the quarantine anchorage, put down its accommodation ladder, and wait for the quarantine medical officer. During inclement weather conditions, a proper shelter will be given to the quarantine boarding officer. Section 9. Requirements from the master of vessels to be inspected. Subsection 9.1. The master of the vessel shall provide these duly accomplished documents: maritime declaration of health, a derating, a passenger and crew of list, a voyage memo, ports of call, a clinical record or cases treated during the voyage if any, or other documents deemed necessary by the quarantine medical officer for the compliance of health regulations. Subsection 9.2. The master of any vessel on which a case or suspected a case of an infectious disease shall notify the Bureau of Quarantine at the next port of call or station. Subsection 9.3. The ship captain must be ordered to muster the crew and passengers on board in a well-lighted and ventilated place for inspection when deemed necessary. Section 10. Kinds of pratique or clearance issued to incoming vessels. Free pratique. A free pratique issued to a vessel which has complied with the quarantine rules and regulations as provided in this IRR. Provision pratique. A provision pratique is issued to vessel which have the following condition: isolation of suspect or actual case of infectious diseases, a quarantine or medical surveillance of exposed passenger or crew, a vessel with cargoes which shall pose a public health threat, expired derating or derating exemption certificate, a vessel suspected of having been exposed to a radiological, a controlled free pratique, a direct berthing privilege, a pratique granted to vessels with a vested request to a direct berthing privilege with conditions. There has been no death, no infectious disease, there is no sick person on board, there has been no death nor illnesses among captive animals. The rating exemption certificate is valid. Radio pratique. A radio pratique granted to military vessels. There should be a ship surgeon on board. The request for radio pratique shall be submitted within 48 hours. The ports visited during the voyage should be stated in the request that no infectious disease. Controlled radio pratique. A pratique granted to cruise vessels under the following conditions. This should There should be a ship surgeon physician on board. The request for controlled radio fatigue shall be submitted to the Bureau within 48 hours. The port visited during the voyage should be stated the request no infectious disease subject to the regulations. There should be no actual suspected case on board of an infectious disease subject to the regulations. The quarantine medical personnel shall board the vessel at the anchorage and conduct quarantine inspection while the vessel is slowly proceeding towards the port. Section 11. Immunization certificate requirements. Yellow fever. Travelers arriving from the yellow fever infected areas are required to present a valid international certificates. Section 12. Extent and method of quarantine inspection. 1. State of health of the passengers and crew. 2. Existence or non-existence of an infectious disease subject to the regulations. Sanitary conditions on board. Type and tonnage of cargo. Section 13. Boarding of vessel from foreign ports placed under quarantine. No person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer and or his duly accredited assistants. Disembarkation of the passengers and crew is not allowed until the vessel is granted clearance. Suspect cases shall be medically evaluated on board. In case when the vessel is exposed to radiological, biological or chemical or RBC terrorism, the tailored action on such incident should be followed in accordance to the interim guidelines. Section 14. Requirements of vessels before departure. No vessel shall be allowed to depart from any seaport of the Philippines to foreign destination without securing an outgoing quarantine clearance. Section 15. Embarkation of travelers for international voyage. The Director of Quarantine, when he considers it necessary, may order the medical examination of travelers and may disallow of any suspected person having infectious disease. Section 16. Personnel assigned for inspection. The quarantine inspection of vessels shall be conducted by quarantine medical officer and or duly accredited assistants designated by the Director of Quarantine. Section 17. Time of vessel quarantine inspection. Inspection of vessel required by this regulation shall be made between 800 hours to 1200 hours and 13 hours to 1700 hours. Mondays to Fridays, any inspection performed outside of these hours and during Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays shall be compensated for. Part 3 of this regulation. Requirements of documents vessel. Section 18. Vessels to be inspected. All domestic vessels plying domestic ports with the presence of infectious disease subject to the regulations are subject to quarantine inspection and clearance. Section 19. Requirements for vessel to be inspected. A clinical record and treated cases during the voyage or the medical incident report of the death on board. A derating. A passenger and crew list. A voyage memo or port of calls. Other documents deemed necessary by the quarantine medical officer for the compliance of the health regulations. The master of an inter-island or domestic vessel on which a case or suspected case of an infectious disease. The ship captain may be ordered to muster the crew and passengers on board in a well-lighted and ventilated place for inspection when deemed necessary. Section 21. Immunization requirements. The Director of Quarantine may from time to time prescribe or require immunization for certain diseases if in his discretion such requirements are essential on account of varying public health conditions. Section 22. Extent and method of quarantine inspection. State of health of the passengers and crew. Existence of non-existence of an infectious disease subject to the regulations. Sanitary conditions on board. Validity of the derating, type and tonnage of cargo. Section 23. Personnel assigned for inspection for inter-island vessel. The quarantine inspection of vessel shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and a duly accredited assistant designated by the director of quarantine. Section 24. Boarding of domestic vessel placed under quarantine. In case of notification of the presence of suspected cases of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern and or death or board, no person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer and his duly accredited assistants. His embarkation of any passengers and crew is not allowed until the vessel is granted a clearance. Suspect cases shall be medically evaluated on board. The remaining passengers and crew of vessel, if the need arises, should be medically evaluated on board the vessel. Crew and passengers who may be possibly exposed to an infectious disease may be isolated or undergo voluntary home confinement or quarantine. Any person who boarded a vessel under quarantine without permission shall be subject to detention and quarantine. Part 4 of this regulation. Requirements of vessels while in port. Section 25. Requirements of vessel while in port. Rat guards on mooring connection lines. If the vessel docks along the piers, all mooring lines shall be provided with prescribed rat guards. Cargo net, gangway, plank, and ramp. Cargo nets should be hauled up when not in use. Distance a vessel from the dock. All vessels should fend off at least 1.5 meters from the dock. Mooring of vessels to another vessel which is moored to a dock. A vessel which shall tie alongside another vessel moored to a dock shall institute all necessary measures to prevent the access of rats from the vessel to another. Section 26. Disposal of garbage. No vessel shall be allowed to dump garbage or waste overboard while in the harbor. Garbage should be collected in prescribed containers for disposal. Section 27. Rat inspection of vessels. The following vessels shall be subjected to the rat inspection while in the harbor. Vessels without derating. Vessels with expired derating. Vessels with valid derating. Any inspection for rat infestation shall be under supervision of the quarantine medical officer, and all findings shall be recorded. Kinds of derating certificate. Derating certificate. A certificate being issued after a derating measure has been performed, such as fumigation and trapping, with 6 months validity upon issuance. Derating exemption certificate. A certificate being issued when there is no evidence of rat infestation on board and is valid for 6 months from the date of issuance. Extension certificate. A certificate being issued which shall be valid for 1 month from the date issuance. All vessels must have valid derating certificate or an extension certificate upon arrival and prior to departure. Section 28. Fumigation. The following are subject to fumigation while in the harbor. Any vessel with human or rodent plague on board. Any vessel moderately or heavily infested with rats or other pests and vermins. Cargoes in a vessel from a plague-infected port which are vulnerable to harbor rats and fleas. Inter-island vessels for their periodic annual fumigation. That's all for my report. Thank you.